Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of The Last Days of Fort Vaux by Henry Bordeaux. Book 2, The Battle. 1. The Flight of the Ravens.
The observers on aeroplanes or balloons who saw the volcano burst into flame declared that they could not mark on their maps all the batteries that were in action. The woods of Consenvoy, Moire, Hingry, and Grimili, the forests of Spincourt and Mangiennes, the hillsides of Romagne and Mormont breathed fire like myriads of monstrous dragons. The commander of a company of light infantry, who was wounded in the foot in Corrèze Wood, stated, "The intensity of the firing was such that when we came out into the open, we no longer recognized the country which we had known for 4 months. There was scarcely a tree left standing. It was very difficult to walk about, because the ground was so broken up with the holes made by the shells. The defenses were very much damaged, but there was such an entangled mass of barbed wire and broken branches that the whole still formed a serious obstacle to the offensive. The communication trenches no longer existed. The main trenches, on the other hand, had been badly knocked about, but were still serviceable. They were instantly manned. This remark proves the superiority of the human will to all the mechanical forces that science can let loose. The Supreme Command drew from it this deduction. What the artillery achieves is the weakening of the material resources of the defense and the wearing down of its morale, not its complete overthrow. Of this hurricane of fire, the fort received its full share. Those are 1,500 millimeter shells. Here comes some 2,100 millimeter. Ah, these are surely 380 millimeter. My vaults are ringing. My vaults are still sound. How are my transverse galleries? They're resisting. And my turret? It is still standing. The observing stations? One has been touched. I can see quite well with one eye. Besides, the damage can perhaps still be made good. A breach in the counterscarp? They'll make it firmer when they stop it up. My big neighbor, Douaumont, has come off even worse than I. He attracts the lightning like some stately oak on a hilltop. I should like to know what is going on. My telephones are no longer working. I am cut off from the rest of the world. Such a storm cannot last. Let us wait for the end. The end does not come. The storm continues to roar and rumble. But bad news comes up the hillsides. No one knows how. On both banks of the Meuse villages are burning, forests crackling, stones crumbling. The nearer one is to things that are happening, the less information one can glean about them. The ration fatigue parties are still the best source of news, but these cooks certainly draw the long bow. They tell some alarming tales. Corrèze Wood was lost the second day. Corrèze Wood, impossible, Dryant is there, unless Dryant is dead. They don't know what has become of him, and if it were only Corrèze Wood that was lost. If they are to be believed, Herbois and Chaume Wood, the village of Ornes, and in the Woevre, Fromzay and Hermeville, the last two abandoned intentionally in order to gain support on the Meuse heights, are in the enemy's hands. Confound those croakers. They are trying to sow the seeds of panic. Their work is certainly carried on under great difficulties. There is no job like it, except that of the scouts. And even the scouts have no load to bear. They jump lightly from shell hole to shell hole. They lie down, burrow themselves in, disappear, get up again, dart off like arrows, and again lay themselves out flat when the hail of bullets cuts off their road. You cannot get along very fast with 20 bowls on your back and water bottles slung across your shoulders, or a whole grocer's shop of tinned food, or bags filled with every kind of provender, and to crown it all, a mask on your face which half stifles you. The mask is worn because of all the poison gases which linger long in the ravines and rifts in the ground, and lie in wait for you, like footpads to seize you by the throat. The bottoms of the valleys are all but impassable. The enemy have got the range of all the roads and have battered them. The second and third lines have suffered as badly from Jack Johnson's as the first. Never, within the memory of men who went out on the first day of the war and have come back, heaven knows how, from the Marne and the Isère, from Artois and Champagne, have we had to face such a deluge of fire and steel. So a cook here is a soldier who comes from the back to the front with honor as well as his burden. On the fourth day, a liaison officer assures us that Les Fosses Wood and Les Courrières Wood have been lost. They are already in the La Vauche ravine. In the La Vauche ravine? Then Douaumont will see them. And now the news grows more abundant, with more men coming and going. Reliefs, wounded, stragglers, fatigue parties meet on the hillsides under the never-ending shower of shells, which is aimed particularly at the fort and its immediate approaches. One needs a sober head to extract a certain measure of truth from these alarming and often contradictory reports. They have been seen at Dieppe. They have been seen quite near Damloop. In the end, they are seen everywhere. The fort, which cheerfully digests its daily ration of projectiles, listens philosophically to these unsettling rumors. It now knows how solid its walls are. What interests it more than anything is the fate of Douaumont. Well, on the evening of February 25th, a Friday, an evening when all who go out are soaked with snow and numbed with cold, comes a wounded man looking for his way. He has hobbled up the hill, the blood from his thigh wound staining the hasty dressing, and reaches the postern, red-eyed and spattered with blood and mud. He dares to announce that they have entered Fort Douaumont. Now really, that is hard to believe. However much you may want your neighbor to get a few hard knocks, you cannot hear of his sudden death without a protest. A fort is not swallowed up like that, and a fort is not a place of refuge. It does not receive any guest without question. Go your way, you trafficker in bad tidings. Still, before you go, give some details if you have any to give. They were seen on the banquettes. It was even thought that they were zouaves in their khaki uniforms. Why, it was the zouaves. They passed here yesterday to go and take up their position. Zouaves would not have fired at us with their rifles. They mistook you for Boches. Night is a bad time for clearing up a mystery. It is better to count on tomorrow, but our hopes are doomed to be shattered. Next day, some riflemen who have drifted back confirm the news. The Germans are at Douaumont. Vaux no longer dreams of talking lightly about the misfortunes of an old comrade. For years they had mounted guard together before Verdun. They lived the same life, a life that was rather sad and lonely. They saw each other at a distance. They signaled to each other. One relied on the other in battle as on a trench mate. If one is dying, the other is in danger. And from the observing station, which is still intact, the fort inspects the slopes of Hardemont and La Cayette, the treacherous ravines and the bare plain of the Woevre. On Sunday, February 27th, its little garrison is strengthened. The reinforcements, territorials from Verdun, bring us no end of rumors. Are they laying on the colors too thick? We shall know later on or never. They say that the Boche has flung himself at Verdun with hell's own artillery, that we knew already, and besides, consider the country round the fort, that he expected to smash, kill, destroy everything and to advance, shouldering arms, over a cleared terrain, that he has found his match instead of the dead whom he hoped to trample on, and that now fresh troops of ours are coming up. The stroke has failed, the road is blocked. Joffre has been watching and waiting to strike at a time and place of his own choosing. What is more, Castelnau has come, and Pétain is there, getting ready to take over command. If Castelnau has come and Pétain is in command, all will be well. And Douaumont? Tell me about Douaumont. The fort is taken. Didn't you know? I knew, but I wouldn't believe it. They won't be left in possession. We are preparing to retake it from them. That'll be a tough job. Those birds like to settle in strange nests. Before you can look round, they have dug themselves in. Tell me anything else you know. The fort whispers to itself, and even what you don't know, for stones have experience and therefore irony. Well, the Iron Division is there, others too, which are unfamiliar to me. At Douaumont village, there is a colonel who says, so long as I have breath in my body, the Boches won't get in. It's always risky to say things like that. The Boches have not got in. They were stopped in front of the village. Our machine guns mowed them down there by hundreds. And that colonel is still alive? Yes, he was picked up and I met him. He has a calm face and fiery eyes. He never raises his voice, yet you hear that voice inside you, controlling you and making you march. It was in his regiment that in Brûlé Wood toward Saint-Mihiel an adjutant shouted, "Arise, ye dead." And did the dead answer? What would you expect them to answer? The dead always answer when they are called. The dead have made the nation which the living carry on. It is the dead who have built me. And the dead are bone of thy bone and flesh of thy flesh, as they are stone of my stone. The sentries, however, have been doubled. Since the enemy is at Douaumont, since he has descended into the Woevre, he is likely to attempt the assault any day. On March 8th, he attacks Vaux village. On the 9th and 10th, he hurls himself against both village and fort. The fort, on its hill, resists the storm, like a ship battered by the waves. Above the battlefield, in the plains of the air, electric waves started from afar are recorded in signs at the receivers and by wireless telegraphy transmit the war news to headquarters, to the nation, to the whole world. They cross each other like flocks of migrant birds and engage in mysterious conflicts. On February 26th, Germany lets loose a first raven, bearing this message. To the east of the Meuse, in the presence of His Majesty the Emperor and King, we achieved some notable gains. Our gallant troops seized the heights to the southeast of Louvemont, the village of Louvemont, and the fortified position farther to the east. With a vigorous push forward, some Brandenburg regiments reached the village and the armored fort of Douaumont, which they took by storm. In the Woevre, the enemy's resistance was shattered on the whole front in the Marcheville district, to the south of the Paris-Metz road. Our troops are pressing hard upon the enemy in his retreat. No assault was made upon Fort Douaumont. It was taken by surprise. All the German attacks on Douaumont village were a complete failure. The Woevre was evacuated by a strategic maneuver, and the enemy, in a distrustful mood, only ventured upon it with considerable qualms, had to stop in front of Manhilles on February 27th, and was unable to enter Fresnes until March 7th. But how much better it looks in a communiqué to represent those worthy Brandenburgers as scaling the glacis of a fort under fire, putting ladders to the counterscarp, climbing to the assault, crossing the ditches, happy to conquer or die under the benign gaze of His Majesty the Emperor and King, who was no doubt present at the ceremony with a golden helmet on his head and a golden sword in his hand. A taste for romantic visions prevails in the German Great General Staff. The second raven is more daring. It is sent forth on March 9th and announces to an eagerly listening world the capture of Fort Vaux. It is the pendant to Douaumont, a diptych offered to the nations. To the east of the river Meuse, in order to shorten the connections to the south of Douaumont with our Woevre lines, the village, the armored fort of Vaux, and the numerous neighboring fortifications belonging to the enemy were seized after the way had been vigorously cleared by our artillery. In a brilliant night attack by the Posen Reserve Regiments, numbers 6 and 19, under the direction of Infantry General von Goretzky-Kornitz, commander of the 9th Reserve Division. How could the attentive world dare to cast doubts on the veracity of a wireless message so definite and so inspiring? The day and hour are given, the numbers of the regiments, the name and title of the general who held command. Such details cannot be invented. Detail is the strong point of the German method. Learning is nothing but a knowledge of details. History, details, or a series of detailed statements. Has Fort Vaux been taken? How should it not have been, seeing that it is General von Goretzky-Kornitz, commanding the 6th and 19th Posen regiments, who took it? Obviously, on the one side, there is the general with his 2 regiments, and on the other there is Fort Vaux. How could Fort Vaux fail to lodge the general and his 2 regiments with him? Is that trunk ours? Asked Robert Macaire of the faithful Bertrand, and he at once concluded, it must be ours. Is the fort ours? The Boche asks himself. It must be ours, and he at once announces the fact. The only drawback is that the fort is not his. It takes this liberty on March 8th, and again on March 9th, and again on the 10th. General von Goretzky-Kornitz, commander of the 9th Reserve Division, gains nothing by vigorously clearing the way with his artillery and by making a brilliant night attack. Yet the German Supreme Command dares not confess to the world that the haughty General von Goretzky-Kornitz has befooled it. Hastily, on March 10th, it sends out a third raven, with this message under his wing. The French have made violent counterattacks on our new front to the east and south of the village, as well as near Fort Vaux. In the course of these engagements, the enemy managed to regain a footing in the armored fort itself. Everywhere else, the enemy were repulsed with heavy losses. That is how the game is played. Let us give back the fort to the French, since they are there and have always been there. Let us give it back, for we are honest and loyal. We give back what we haven't got. What ground have the French for complaint? We have given them back a fort by a counterattack. We credit them with a counterattack which they have never made. We ascribe to them a success which they have not obtained. The world will admire us. The world will say, there is true Teutonic frankness. The Germans had taken Fort Vaux. It was a splendid gain. Next day they lost it. Well, they don't hesitate to proclaim the fact. We can certainly rely on the German communiques. They confess the truth when things go against them. They play the game. But lying requires a continuity of effort of which the most cunning impostors are rarely capable. It is only the man who tells the truth that never burns his fingers. 3 months later, measure those 3 months later, exactly 88 days. In other words, the whole interval between the announcement of March 9th and the real fall of the fort, June 7th in the early morning, 88 days of heat and cold, of weariness, of thirst and lack of sleep, of bombardments and assaults. 3 months later, Fort Vaux is really taken. The German High Command knows what the cost is. It proudly announces the news. It forgets its wireless message of March 9th. It says, the armored Fort Vaux is occupied by us. It does not dare to say, the armored fort of Vaux is reoccupied by us.
2. The Road. March 11th.
Here is Verdun, like a Florence of the North, in the midst of its amphitheater of hills. After days of frost and snow, so pitiless to our men in the demolished trenches, which are now mere conglomerations of shell holes, a soft spring air has suddenly come to relax the numbed limbs and the frozen earth. The surprise is so great that it brings to unaccustomed lips that charming and unexpected name of Florence. It is the hour of sunset, a sunset that bathes the undulating line of the hills in gold and mauve and lights up the dismal waters of the flooded Meuse. At the foot of the gloomy cathedral, so different from the graceful Sainte-Marie-des-Fleurs with its colored marble, one crosses a passage under half-ruined walls and reaches a terrace which looks out over all the tragedy of Verdun. Gutted houses stripped of their outer wall, and with their furniture hanging loose like the inwards of slaughtered cattle. Crumbled facades, doors opening on the void, slashed and jagged fragments of walls, often topped by tall, useless chimneys. All this, which is now a mere shapeless mass of rubbish, was once the Rue Mazil, the busiest, gayest, and liveliest quarter of Verdun, and of that wartime Verdun which was far more bright, animated, and amusing than the Verdun of peaceful days. The bombardment has brought into prominence the ancient ramparts, dating no doubt from the time of the prince bishops, which girdle the upper city and around which the ruins of the new city now group themselves. A stray dog, the sole living creature that wanders through the deserted streets, utters plaintive barks. Shells fall on Jardin Fontaine. Right above the city, one aeroplane is chasing another. You hear the tick-tack of their machine guns. The German hastily makes his way back to his own lines. I am living in a whitewashed cell in a Verdun barracks. Rolled up in a blanket, I am sleeping on a camp bed when Major P rushes in like a whirlwind and, flashing his little electric lamp, wakes me up with a start. At the outset of the campaign, he had offered me a more sumptuous hospitality in the cellars of Bac. The cellars of Bac were replete with carpets, armchairs, mirrors, and art bronzes. We ate from patterned china and drank from fine glass. Even if the tableware was an odd set, it gave one an impression of wealth and luxury. We took a boat down the Aisne. At times, the bullets accompanied us like a swarm of bees, and the water seemed to prolong their mournful whistle. When we went down in order to get shelter into those famous vaulted cellars, decorated like drawing rooms whose mirrors double the perspective, we basked in unexpected comfort. "Do you want to go to Fort Vaux?" the major asks me, point blank. "It's the chance of a lifetime. 3 officers are needed tonight, one at the fort, the other at Vaux village, the third at Damloop. We start in a quarter of an hour." I had expressed a wish to make this pilgrimage. My wish is now to be granted. The order is immediately given. It is essential, he adds, to start at night so as to explore the ground in the early morning. A quarter of an hour later, we get into a motor car Captain L of the Army Corps staff and I. On the way, we pick up Captain H of the divisional staff. We follow the Étain road, then leave the car to scramble up a wooded slope and reach the divisional headquarters. The zone of death begins. The road which we have just left is bordered by an inextricable mass of fragments of wagons, open sacks, dirty harness, rifles, and distended bodies of horses, their legs in the air, their bellies ripped open. In the wood, our route is sometimes obstructed by broken branches, and our feet catch on tree stumps or stumble in the craters. When the shells plow up the soil in our vicinity, a column of black smoke, like sooty dust, poisons the clear night air. For the night is perfectly clear. Between the trees, the moon sheds a bluish light, a sort of softened day, delicate and modest, as if she refused to let us probe the wounds of the earth. We now go down into a ravine by a path that winds like a mountain track. The gradient is steep, and it is best to go quickly. The enemy have obtained the range of the place, and it is shelled without respite. A corpse is there, and has to be strode over. Lower down, in front of headquarters, there is another that seems to sleep under its helmet. A pious hand has put the helmet back over the mangled face. We enter the dugout. After a passage, where the liaison officers lie sleeping close together, comes a wainscoted room with a chair and a table, and at the back an iron bedstead. The Chief General de B is poring over his map. He sits up in his chair when he sees us. He is young and cheerful, with clear eyes and an incisive manner of speech. Only one sign of weariness, the hollows under his eyes. How many such leaders I have seen in action, surmounting physical ordeals and dangers, bearing without a murmur the weight of all the lives entrusted to their charge, when their most loyal aides were succumbing to sleep or anxiety. They quietly bent their brains to the study of a plan of campaign and carefully arranged, without the dangerous counsels of feverish haste, the minutest details of some operation. The Germans are at the foot of the Fort Vaux and even halfway up. The slopes descend gently at first, in front of the fort, for a space of 300 or 400 yards at most. Then they rush down abruptly to the Woevre plain. This rapid descent makes a right angle, which our artillery cannot touch because of its trajectories. The Germans are established there. It is important that they should be dislodged. What line do they follow below Hardemont, past the village, and farther to the east near Damloop? Before action is taken, this point must be accurately determined. There has been fighting these last few days, and the position remains slightly confused. Our caravan, then, will split up into 3. Each of us will have his objective Vaux, the fort, and Damloop, and each his guide. I recall those confabulations on the mountains before undertaking a climb which offered some difficulty or other, or in Lovatel's hut in Dauphiné, those little councils of war on the eve of a chamois hunt. One would take this path, another that couloir. Another speaks of a dangerous place and thinks it best to use a rope. After this, at daybreak, we shake hands and set off, each by his own route, to meet at the appointed place. We go up the side of the ravine again and come to a wood that grows sparser and sparser. Yes, it is indeed the beginning of a difficult climb. The air is keen, and so bright is the moon that the stars are scarcely visible. As we climb higher, the vegetation becomes more scanty. The trees are now stunted. A few hardy larches with twisted roots persist in growing. Then comes the zone of sickly shrubs. Finally, there is nothing left but the bare ground. The same order is found here. Around me there are a large number of trees, but they are in fragments, the branches broken, the trunks battered, the roots protruding from the riven soil, and soon they are nothing but miserable broomsticks. The summit, where lies the region of ice and desolation, cannot be far off. Yet the mountain has the unrivaled advantage of silence. We accustom ourselves so quickly to the murmur of the torrents that roll at the bottom, and even that murmur is like the hidden refrain that accompanies a daydream. Here we are obsessed by that continual, sharp, menacing, formidable whistle which precedes the bursting of a shell. And sometimes we have to stop, to lie down, or to plunge into a crater. There are only too many places to choose from, and wait until the storm has passed over. When the curtain fire breaks off for a while, we resume our journey. The ground is riddled like a sieve. At the crossroads, the corpses, men or horses, lie in piles. The light of the moon covers them with a mysterious winding sheet. We stop at the stone quarry, which forms the brigade headquarters. There, too, a chief is still awake and finishing a plan of operations. Tall, very youthful-looking, with a ringing voice and a hearty manner, he too appears one of those born trainers of men who know how to unite method with dash. What a clearness they all show in their reports and anticipations. What importance they attach to the sparing of lives. What frankness in their tone. What an art of going straight to the point. Here there is no longer any toadying or vanity or desire to please. A sort of moral elevation, the result of their leadership, has come to mark their character. When one is acquainted with the matter in hand, a simple telephone conversation is a model of clear language and logical reasoning. Thus, from one post to another, the dialogue is prolonged into the night. One seems to visit a series of catacombs where a rite is performed by the dim light of the sanctuary lamp. One goes away with a sense of religious reverence. "Good luck," says the colonel to me as he escorts me out over the threshold. "I am going to rest for a few hours." It is 2 o'clock in the morning. The worst part of the journey is still to come. 15 to 1800 yards over a tableland, which by day is here and there, vaguely guarded from sight by copses, but for the greater part of the time is quite devoid of cover. By moonlight, our outlines will scarcely stand out above the road over the ridge. The return journey, if we set out again after sunrise, will be a little more complicated. We walk in Indian file, the guide, Captain P of the brigade staff, who wished to accompany me and myself. The shells fall like hail. The earth which they have churned up has crumbled to such an extent that it looks like a mass of cinders. 15 to 1800 yards is much farther than one thinks. One has time to make a rapid mental survey of one's whole career. Again, it is mountaineering memories that surge up in my brain. This time, it is the journey through a gorge, the Neuweistor, between the valley of Fay and that of Zermatt in the Valais Alps. We had taken an unfamiliar path. We had to follow a ridge, which on either side looked out over a precipice. On the right, we could make out a very uninviting crevasse. On the left, right at the bottom, the little Italian village of Macugagna appeared at such a sheer drop beneath us that we had the feeling that, if we were to stumble, we should certainly roll down to it, 2,000 or 3,000 feet below. The ridge was so narrow that we could not place one foot alongside of the other, and we did not know where to pitch our ice axes. To make matters worse, while the guide was a level-headed man, the porter who brought up the rear of our roped party had fuddled himself with drink before starting. We were at the mercy of a false step on the part of this tippler, but his professional honor had passed into his legs. The ridge ends in a sort of stone tower, where one may gain a really firm foothold and breathe freely. There, on turning round, I saw my man, streaming with sweat and his eyes starting out of his head. He had worked all the alcohol out of his system and had fully recovered his faculties as guide. The track that we are now pursuing is not so hard to follow, but in other ways it is beset with terrors. Every moment we have to walk across bodies flung across it. At every 10 or 12 yards, soon at every 5 or 6 paces, we are compelled to stride over a corpse or even bunches of corpses, some slashed and torn, others in a running posture as if they had been overtaken while in full activity. The light of the moon softens the horror of their wounds without altogether veiling it. Many of them belong to the scouts who ensure connections, carry orders, show routes to be followed. In this war, where men vie with one another in every kind of heroism, we must pay a special tribute to those soldiers who, while their comrades dig themselves in as best they can under the hurricane of fire, run about in the open in order to make up for signaling difficulties or for the breaking of telephone wires. Thanks to these men, efforts are coordinated and an understanding is maintained at all points of the front so that the chain of unity holds together. If one falls, there is at once another to take his place. The remainder are always ready. They even offer their services before their turn comes. Prepared to go upon the most perilous errands, they form a mobile guard round their chief. They are the projecting rays of his brain which, through them, directs men's wills from afar, and draws up or corrects the plans of an operation. Those who have fallen there, or at any rate some of them, seem to have assumed in death the attitude of those antique youths who handed on to each other the sacred torch in the race. Is it the moon that helps me to see these broken statues? Shall I once more find such marble visions by daylight? The crude light of day does not do justice to the beauty of death. The soldier who acts as our guide marches at a good rate. He gives the signal to stop when a shell falls too close to us, or when the cadence of the explosions points to a systematic curtain fire. He does not pick out the places for halting, and makes us come to a standstill suddenly with corpses under our very noses. Lucky indeed if our faces are not splashed with fragments of flesh crushed once more by that ghastly pestle. But why does he stop at this moment? Just now the tempo seems to be slackening. Surely we ought to take advantage of this respite. Ah, there he is, stripping a dead soldier. He half raises him and takes off one by one the straps which the man wears in banderole. In this way he unfastens 4 or 5 water bottles, each holding 4 pints. These he unscrews and sniffs at in turn, not without anxiety on account of the shells which might interrupt him at his task. His face lights up. The water is drinkable. The man whom he has stripped so methodically carried a supply of water for replenishment, and water on this dried-up tableland is as precious as in the desert. The place from which it is drawn is at the foot of the hillside. You are not sure of getting there or of coming back. At the fort, so many lips are thirsty for fresh water. The guide, with his water bottle straps round his waist, hastily resumes his journey, drawing us after him as a roebuck draws a pack of hounds. At this pace, we pass a caravan of porters loaded with a consignment of grenades. They are marching as fast as their burden allows them, under the rain of steel. The only means of transport here is the human back. Poor little men, whose heart is still the greatest of all military forces. It is a scientific war, people have declared. Victory lies with munitions. It is the munitions that crush and destroy everything. Well, when the artillery thinks to have destroyed everything, the human will still offers a wall of flesh as a resistance. Men have endured everything, fire, hunger, cold, and thirst, and still they rise out of the shattered soil. No war will be found to have given such examples of the superiority of man to the machine. The countryside looks all scorched and burnt. The lava of a volcano, the shocks of an earthquake, all the cataclysms of nature would not have flayed it more unmercifully. It is a chaos without a name, a circle in Dante's Inferno. I rack my memory for parallel scenes, perhaps certain alpine solitudes where the glaciers have withdrawn or the moraines alternate with precipices, solitudes that have never heard the song of a bird or felt the contact of a living creature. The craters meet and open like the yawning mouths of volcanoes. Broken branches, scattered boulders, detritus of all kinds, and shreds of human flesh are mingled. A nameless stench rises from the tortured soil. In front of us rises a wall covered with earth. There are gashes in it, and through these cracks the stones have fallen into the ditch. On the whole, however, it has borne the avalanche without flinching. 3/4 of the vaulted door is masked by a mass of concrete, dislodged by a 380 or 420 millimeter shell. It is like the cave of the Cyclops, which had a rock for its door, and which received Ulysses and his companions. Past the open space, we scurry along quickly, for it is specially favored by the enemy's artillery, as the corpses, more numerous here, bear witness. Even so did the Cyclops kill all strangers. What is my surprise at finding the interior of the fort undamaged? It must have been built of solid materials to resist such a hammering. The staircase, the passages, the rooms are crammed. A curious sight is the swarm of men under the electric lights. Sleepers lying in every conceivable pose, some stretched out anywhere, others curled up so as to occupy the least possible space, all impervious to noises, refusing to wake up, enjoying the delicious relaxation of sleep removed from danger. Fatigue parties making their way with difficulty through the crush, guards going on or returning from duty, wounded men with white bandages on their wounds. Isolated squads looking for their company. One guesses the cause of this confusion, which will have to be remedied. The fort, on its tableland, plays the part of those mountain refuges where lost caravans come to find shelter from the storm. It is a haven of safety. He who succeeds in crossing the danger zone can breathe freely under the arched vaults. Little by little, the march past becomes more orderly, and organization is introduced into the mob. The right is reserved for those coming in, the left for those going out. Here is the ambulance, there is the guard room, there is the orderly room. On our arrival, our guide is received with enthusiasm. His array of water bottles earns him an ovation. Thirst is working havoc here. The nearest source of water is in the Fontaine ravine, and that ravine is constantly peppered with shot. Yet men risk their skins to go and get a drink. Water creates such pitiful mirages. In the shapeless furrows which serve them as shelters, the troops, with parched lips, wait for water with feverish impatience. They are reduced sometimes to drinking the tainted water that stagnates in the shell holes, and to other strange expedients. Who will ever tell of all the horrors endured for Verdun and for that France which is behind Verdun? A soldier, somewhat elderly, no doubt a territorial, comes in with rolls of bread on his back. He is near collapsing. He pants. The sweat pours off him in big drops. His face is white as chalk. "You are alone?" asks the sergeant of the guard. "Where is the rest of the fatigue?" The man makes a vague gesture. The rest of the fatigue has not followed, will never get here. Still, the rations it was bringing must be looked for. Where will they be found? Far from here. Another gesture of weariness, of indifference, of ignorance. One cannot guess which. "Well, do explain yourself." The soldier lays down his load and stands up straight. "I'll go back," is all he says. And he crosses the threshold again, followed by two men whom the sergeant has told off. The commandant of the fort made me visit his domain, the casemates of Bourges, the observing stations, of which one is still fit for use, the cupola deprived of its 75mm gun. We run across the commander of the 3rd Battalion of Light Infantry, who holds the sector in front of the fort up to the village, and the battalion chaplain, the Abbé C., who, under his helmet, with his weather-beaten features and his long beard, looks like a crusader rather than a monk. The latter comes from the neighboring redoubt, a little earthwork where he had set up a dressing station, which he has had to remove. "Yesterday," he told me, "our riflemen brought in a prisoner, groaning loudly and constantly repeating in a piteous tone, 'Wir Kinder,' 4 children." For the benefit of those who knew no German, he made gestures illustrating a row of figures of different heights and counted up to 4 on his fingers. Our men put him in a corner of the redoubt, which is very narrow, while they themselves, for want of room, remained in the doorway, exposed to the bursting shells. The commandant, as he passed by, ordered them to abandon this quixotic arrangement. Stroking his beard, he adds philosophically, "After all, whatever comes here comes from the prisoner's lines. It is only fair that he should be able to appreciate its quality." The commandant of the fort leads me out onto the parapets, which are continually being demolished and continually repaired. "Be careful. In order to get there, we have to cross as quickly as possible a zone which is under fire from an enemy machine gun. More treacherous than the whistling of shells, the bullets pass above our heads, but he himself does not hurry in the least. Here are posted in the hollowed-out earth, finding places as best they can, the lookout men, and in shelters very little safer, our machine guns. Dawn begins to appear, eclipsing the light of the moon. Half lying on the parapet, I see a glorious spring sunrise. It awakens the plains of the Woevre, lighting up the rivulets and pools. Here is Vaux village on the right and Damlout village on the left. Farther on, that large cluster of ruined houses must be Étain. In the rising sun, they form a white lacework of stone, recalling the cities of the east. And yonder are the frowning hillsides of Hardemont. Douaumont towers above, Douaumont still swathed in darkness like an evil spirit. More efficiently than the enemy, the sunshine climbs the slopes of the fort. It is light and airy, like a bearer of good tidings. Smiling, it shows me in front, 200 or 300 yards beyond the counterscarp, on the sloping turf, several greenish lumps almost dressed in line. They are the bodies of Germans mown down in the onslaughts of March 9th. They have fallen in front of the barbed wire. One could count them. Already their numbers are diminished. At night, their comrades draw them into their lines by means of hooks or ropes. The sun has left the rim of the earth and is speedily mounting the horizon. The morning is of an exquisite softness that contrasts strangely with the tragic scene. Behind me is chaos, in front a charnel heap. Yet up above a lark is singing. His wings flap and his claws quiver, but he does not change his place in the rose-tinted heavens. I watch this sweet songster fluttering overhead, as if it were pecking at the light. A lookout man raises his eyes to catch sight of it. He looks at it tenderly for a moment, then resumes his watching. The passing shells do not disturb it in the slightest. What is happening down there, among the corpses in green uniforms? One of them has made a movement. He glides through the grass like a snake. The enemy uses his dead as a screen or a blind, and is coming in this way to spy out the land. A lookout man has also observed this uncanny resurrection. He fires. Nothing moves. We must have been mistaken. A long time afterwards, a little below the suspected point, a body jumps up and abruptly disappears at a spot where the gradient is very steep and forms dead ground. As in the mountains, I sweep the horizon with my gaze and give names to the valleys and hills. Douaumont on my right is the loftiest summit, 1,200 feet. Only Souville at the back makes any approach to this. It seems like some incubus weighing upon the whole surrounding country. I am separated from it by the wooded slopes of Vaux-Chapitre, by the ravine of Le Basile, whose existence I guess at, and by the rising wood of La Cayette. Above the Wouvray, Hardemont rears its head like a cliff. The Wouvray stretches out as far as the eye can see, broken up with undergrowth and villages, and streaked with roads. In broad daylight, I get a better idea of its bareness, which was veiled by the kindly dawn. Its untilled soil resembles a vast marsh. On the right, my eyes rest on the dark blur of Hermeville Wood. The outlying spurs of the Meuse Heights hide a portion of it from view. It is there, towards the village, over against those hillsides, over against Damloup, that the enemy's onslaught was shattered. And the fort on its plateau, with its superstructure half crushed, with breaches in its double wall, seems like the formidable hulk of an ironclad which still floats upon the waters, not yet abandoned by its crew. The storm thought to overwhelm it, and it has vanquished the storm. We stayed very late in order to see everything in accordance with our instructions. 9 o'clock in the morning, the sun is already high in the heavens. The sky is clear, the day is a good one for observations, and the Boche balloons are watching us. The crossing of the ridge threatens to be difficult. As a matter of fact, it is difficult to go out at all. We are at once encircled. Life hangs by a thread. The corpses, now indiscreet, display ghastly wounds. Only a few are intact. It is hard to find the broken statues I saw in the moonlight. And the realization of death, in the revolt of one's whole being, is invested with a special horror, that of being crushed and pulverized, of being not even a dead man, but a nameless heap, a handful of fleshly dust. Then, too, there is the thought of remaining unburied. This idea did not come spontaneously. We walked across 2 corpses, a little soldier, very young, quite beardless, no doubt of the 1915 class, covered with a little earth, 2 or 3 shovelfuls, which did not suffice to hide him, and quite near him, a stretcher-bearer, identified by his Red Cross armlet, his head split open, still clasping a spade in his hand. The stretcher-bearer was killed while trying to carry out his pious duty of interment. Here the stricken must be left uncared for. We must let death bury the dead. There is a legend which says that the souls of those who have not been laid in consecrated ground wander in space without ever finding rest. But the soil of our invaded country is consecrated ground. May those who have fallen there in defending it rest in peace. For the appeal of the Church, memento quia pulvis es, remember because thou art dust, which accompanies the placing of the ashes on the brows of the faithful, could I ever have thought out a more eloquent paraphrase? A last rationing party meets us. It has not been able to reach its goal during the night. By day, it is not usual to go to the fort. Are you going as far as the fort? We'll have a try. Good luck.
3. The Master of the Hour. March 14th.
In the courtyard of those Verdun barracks where I spent such a brief night, there is a slightly larger crowd than usual, and everyone follows with his eyes two generals who are walking at a leisurely pace. One is dressed in a sky blue uniform, like the rank and file, like everyone. His tanned face, every expression of which I know well, it combines great kindliness with an intellect always in search of certainty and precision, betrays the secret that racks him. He is in command of the most exposed, the most frequently attacked, the most difficult sector of the whole front of the army which covers Verdun, and at this moment, of the entire front of the French army. It touches Fort Douaumont and guards Fort Vaux. He lives heart and soul with his men, who are down there in the whirlwind of steel, holding out against all odds. He shares the burden of their hardships and their exertions. He is consumed with anxiety to know. The desire to conquer is fretting his body. His features bear ample witness to the fire that burns within. The other, tall and massively built, wears the old-fashioned uniform, to whose colors the eye is unaccustomed. Red trousers, black tunic, red cap, with a double band of oak leaves. He seems to be gazing at an invisible point above the head of the person whom he is addressing. While listening, he seems to be under the spell of some inner dream. He wears a thick white moustache. His eyes have a faraway look. Are the realities of the present enough for them, or do they need a map of the world to satisfy them? The two have stopped near our group. The senior general says to his companion, as if putting an end to their conversation, a conversation in which up to now he has scarcely uttered a word, "All is well, and now you need feel no uneasiness." The other seems to be surprised. He is in a state of deadly anxiety, and he is urged to be calm. He is apparently waiting for something more, but this is really the end of the discussion. A motor car has been summoned. He salutes and goes off. You need feel no uneasiness. One of my comrades, who in his brief leisure moments is rereading Tolstoy's War and Peace, and is blessed with a portentous memory, reminds me of the passage where Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, aide-de-camp to General Bagration, comes to report to his chief what he has been able to find out about the forces that are threatening the Russian army. Quote, while listening to him, Prince Bagration stared in front of him, and Prince Andrei, while studying the strongly marked features of that face whose eyes were half-closed, wandering, and sleepy, asked himself, with an uneasy curiosity, what thoughts, what feelings were hidden behind that impenetrable mask. Unquote. The eyes here are also staring, but at some point far away, as if to see beyond the horizon of Verdun. All is well, says Bagration simply, as if what he has just heard had been anticipated by him. And what he has just heard is the menace that weighs upon his army. What our general has just heard has caused him no anxiety. He has answered, all is well, as if the menace could in no way alter his plans. Later on, this recollection, throwing light on the phrase which had almost shocked me, was to assume a singularly precise outline in my mind, and to widen like those ripples which are formed in water when a stone is flung in and grow larger and larger until they reach the banks.
4. The first fights round Vaux. March 9th, 10th, 11th.
From the road, I see soldiers stretched out on the grass, basking in the spring sun, fishing in the river, or playing ball like schoolboys. Motor omnibuses pick them up suddenly, not far from the Verdun battlefield, to carry them to this abode of rustic peace. They do not even hear the guns any longer. It is strange to contrast this bucolic scene with the fiery furnace of Vaux. Among the valleys of the Meuse region, which are generally rather grim and gloomy, the valley of La Salle is the most smiling, the richest in flowers, the most attractive. A crystal-clear brook waters its meadows and seems, with all its meanderings, to run an endless course. Here is Montier-sur-Saulx, where the 303rd Brigade is billeted for a few days. The Sire de Joinville lived there. In the archives of the town hall, one may read the charter by which he allowed the villagers the use of a part of his forest. Jeanne d'Arc went through it, dreaming of her mission. The troops in blue-gray caps who stroll round the central square where the military band plays are not so very different, in their bright uniforms, from the men-at-arms of bygone days. In little groups the men walk about, light their pipes, and chat with the natives. The whole scene looks like a day of peacetime maneuvers, and the very gait of the men is so brisk that one might fancy them to be fresh troops recently detrained here and ready to proceed again to the front. Yet the sentry who is mounting guard at the town hall wears a cap that has been pierced by a bullet. Other caps are indented or knocked out of shape. More than one of these peaceful ramblers has his head bandaged or shows some scar on his face. The colonel in command of the brigade has on his cheek a saber cut on which the blood has just dried, a trifling wound which has not been deemed worthy of dressing. These are the men who broke the back of the German assaults on the village and fort of Vaux on March 8th, 9th, and 10th. They can scarcely remember that they forced the enemy to retreat. They are too much occupied with forgetting their miseries. The cold, the snow, the lack of sleep, the long hours they spent crouching down in rifle pits, their lost comrades, the continual presence of death during the bombardment, which shatters men's nerves and stuns their brains. None of them, of his own accord, makes any allusion to his recent experiences, merely a word or two here and there, which cannot be understood save by those who have been through the mill. Later on, at home or in some other theater of war, when the events are really buried in the past, they will tell the story after their own fashion, nor will they hesitate to weave into the tale other episodes drawn from earlier or later combats. For the moment, they content themselves with saying that Verdun beats everything. The Argonne, Artois, Champagne, Ailly Wood, Le Pretre Wood. These comparisons by men who know give a correct order of merit. They find no satisfaction in raking up what is past and done with, except to say that the Boche will not break through, in spite of their confounded heavy artillery. They revel in the joy of living quietly and without danger. They are almost inclined to pinch themselves so as to make sure that they are still alive. The nightmare visions that haunt them yet might leave them in doubt on the point. One must associate for a long time with officers and men in order to unravel the truth little by little and reconstruct the earlier Vaux engagements. Properly speaking, there were no earlier Vaux engagements. The series of operations forms an unbroken chain. Masters of Douaumont, on February 25th, the Germans at once tried to profit by their success. Douaumont could not be of any real use to them unless they succeeded in debouching from it to march on the line formed before Verdun by the hill of Froid de Terre, the village of Fleury on the other side of the ridge, Fort Souville, and Fort Tavannes. With this aim in view, they will try to make progress to the east, in Nave Wood, which is intersected by a series of ravines favorable to an offensive, going down from the slopes of Douaumont towards the Meuse, the ravines of Helly, La Couleuvre, and La Dame, to reach the earthwork of Thiaumont, and from there that of Froid Terre. Their maneuvers will be the same to the east, in the wood of La Cayette and that of Gardaumont, which are also split up by ravines, those of La Cayette and La Fausse Côte, to descend into the ravine of Le Basile, and to climb up again by Vaux-Chapitre Wood in the direction of Souville. On both sides they will find the road blocked, and they will fall tooth and nail upon the village and fort of Vaux to the east, positions whose capture is equally essential to the realization of their scheme. Driven back from La Cayette Wood, they will approach by way of Hardaumont Wood, the village which gives the key to the ravines of Le Basile and Les Fontaines. They will make a frontal attack on the fort by its northeastern slopes, aided by the formation of the ground which, once the foot of the slopes is occupied, enables them to advance, out of sight and out of artillery range, on account of the angle of descent, to within 300 or 400 yards of the counterscarp wall. Our 303rd Brigade, 408th and 409th Regiments, occupies, during the night of March 1st and 2nd, the section from La Cayette to Damloup. A battalion of the 408th holds the slopes of the fort, and 2 battalions of the 409th hold the cemetery and the village. The fort itself has for a garrison 2 companies of the 71st Territorial Regiment, composed of worthy natives of Anjou, level-headed and hard-working. But let not the reader imagine a line of continuous, fully equipped trenches with communication passages, dugouts, store depots, and so forth. The violence of the German attack launched on February 21st against Verdun has for the time being substituted field fighting for siege warfare. The lines of defense have been carried back to the rear, and the artillery has swept the terrain to such an extent that it has destroyed all the existing defenses. Nothing is left but shell holes and rubbish heaps. It was imperative to hold fast to this devastated soil, to hang on it, to break it up with the pickaxe, and failing pickaxes, with the bayonet, with fingernails, to live on top when one could not get below ground, to keep awake and watchful, to shoot, to kill, to die without accepting defeat. During the early days of its occupation of the sector, the brigade makes a little progress in Hardemont Wood. A company seizes the southern earthwork and entrenches itself there. But on March 5th, 6th, and 7th, the bombardment is so violent that it is impossible to consolidate the position. Replenishing is done with difficulty. An attack is imminent. It takes place on the 8th about 11 o'clock in the morning towards the village. It is led by the famous Gorecki Kornitz Brigade, 6th and 19th Regiments, which was destined next day to be immortalized in the German wireless. It debouches partly from Hardemont Wood, where our earthwork is lost, partly from the railway embankment which skirts it and has served as a screen. The waves of enemy infantry succeed in outflanking our first line and swamping an entire battalion. Our machine guns bring them to a halt at the entrance to the village, which they have succeeded in reaching. They even occupy a few houses. Before our fire, the breakers recoil, but with the prisoners taken from our outflanked first line. A little later, when a fresh assault is launched farther to the east, between the cemetery and the slopes of the fort, the enemy grenadiers who precede it are clothed in uniforms and caps taken from the prisoners, and they shout in French with a heavy Teutonic accent, "Don't shoot!" adding even the number of the regiment, 409th, whose facings they are wearing, although the numerals have been torn off. Already, in the morning, in order to approach the ravine, the enemy has made use of another ruse which he has employed more than once. Stretcher-bearers, ostentatiously displaying their Red Cross armlets, seem to be carrying a stretcher or digging a grave. The stretcher contains a machine gun. The grave is an embryo trench. For all that, this series of assaults has brought the enemy up to the approaches to the village and cemetery of Vaux. Through what defect in coordination does he fancy it to be already within his grasp? Has his half-success of the previous day turned his head? On the morning of March 9th, he sends 2 or 3 companies of the 19th Regiment to occupy his vaunted gain. The companies quietly enter Vaux in columns, without previous reconnaissances. Now a battalion of ours has just come up to reinforce us during the night of 8th-9th under the command of Major Delattre. It celebrates its arrival by a furious fire, at once counterattacks with the bayonet, and throws the enemy back to the ravine of Hardemont. Major Delattre, rifle in hand, goes at the head of his men. He is past 50. His age and the hardships of the campaign have earned him retirement, but he has refused it. A son and a brother of his have fallen in the war, and he is thus tied to his post by sacred bonds. He knows, by the way, what will befall him. The evening before, he confided his presentiments in quite a cheerful spirit to a comrade. "There are families marked out for the salvation of the country. It is an honor. I shall follow in the footsteps of my son and my brother." And so it turned out. He was killed on the ground that had been regained. On the 9th, during the day, the enemy renews his onslaught and manages to establish himself in the eastern portion of Vaux village and in the cemetery. He tries to reach the fort by its northern side, but cannot get near. Our fire brings him to a halt at the trench dug behind the barbed wire, 200 or 300 yards from the earthwork. The day of the 10th will be still more of an ordeal. The Germans have to justify the lying communiqué which told the world of the capture of Fort Vaux. Throughout the night of March 9th, the 10th, and the day of the 10th, the artillery, in clearing the way, overwhelms the fort with projectiles of every caliber and tries to isolate it by a curtain fire which makes a special mark of the lower end of La Horne on the Damloup side, the ravine of Les Fontaines in Vaux-Chapitre Wood, and the advanced works of Souville. Accordingly, the fort and that part of the village which remains in our hands form an islet swept from end to end by gunfire, where the infantry, when it marches, thinks that it will find nothing but debris of war stores and a garrison, either wiped out or so much reduced and dispirited that it will be incapable of defense. But the reinforcements have come in spite of all. The 3rd Battalion of Light Infantry is in reserve, ready to lend its aid to the brigade which is fighting. The territorials of the 71st are still sending out fatigue parties for water, food, and munitions. The scouts have not abandoned their duties. This is the continual miracle of Verdun. Under an unprecedented bombardment, everything is done as before: reliefs, replenishing, the linking up of connections. A sense of order directs the whole, and the work gets done. Major Belleculet is in command at the fort. Besides the 2 companies of territorials, he has at his disposal a battalion of regulars. He has organized his defense in front of the fort, on the slopes already approached the previous evening, protected by 2 rows of barbed wire. The enemy pays less attention to these slopes than to the fort itself, either because he believes his own lines to be nearer, or because, in order to bring his troops close to their objective, he wishes to profit by the more rapid descent from the tableland onto the plains of the Woevre after the 200 or 300 yards of gentle incline in front of the counterscarp. From 8 o'clock in the morning, on the observing station which remains intact, the commandant sees small groups of men go down the slopes of Hardemont and mass themselves to the left of the railway. He calculates the forces whose range he has got to be 3 battalions. No doubt the reserves, out of sight, are more numerous. At noon, the bombardment increases in force. At 6 o'clock in the evening, it breaks off abruptly. The village and fort are both attacked at once. This is the sudden frontal attack, daring, almost foolhardy, which the enemy pursued with success at the outset of the Verdun battle, relying on his artillery superiority and on surprise or loss of nerve in the ranks of his opponents. He is not master of La Cayette Wood or of Damloup. He has no grip either on our right or on our left. He confines operations to a stubborn obstacle whose possession would ensure him a salient in our lines, and he dashes against it as hard as he can, like a battering ram against a door. On the fort, the assault is delivered in successive waves, not in a cordon but in small columns, now directly in front of the parapets, now slantwise on our left between the cemetery and the fort, where he finds a battalion of the 408th. In the barbed wire, there are gaps that our men have been unable to repair, dating from previous bombardments. No doubt the enemy, from photographs by his airmen, imagines them to be more important than they really are. He is faced by our machine guns and rifles along the whole line. From 6 to 8 in the evening, he returns to the charge with a tenacity and vigor which it is only fair to acknowledge. He wants to break through at all costs. All his efforts are in vain. Our gallant lads' rifles grow so hot that they have to be relieved. The territorials ask, as a favor, to be allowed to undertake this shift. They acquit themselves even better than their young comrades. They remember their lying in wait for game and their fine marksmanship on Sundays on the borders of the forests of Anjou. To be a good shot, one needs a steady nerve, and one must never be in a hurry. Inside the fort, the soldiers of the regular battalion have finished cleaning and greasing their rifles. They feel comparatively comfortable. One of them, however, makes a suggestion. The old Uns are still down there. Are they to be left there, they in front and we behind? No one looks reluctant. The officers have no need to insist, but the old Uns will not hear of giving up the position, which they consider a good one, since the field of fire is perfect but for that confounded drop in the ground where the Boches vanish as if through a trapdoor. The 75 gun plays its part in the affray. Its curtain fire at the foot of Hardemont works wonders. From the parapets one sees legs and arms flying in the air. The reinforcements will not come. They are urgently needed. Night has fallen. A second lieutenant attached to the brigade staff and dispatched to this part of the battlefield comes down from the fort at a run. In spite of the cold, he is perspiring when he reaches headquarters. "A drink," he shouts, like Gargantua at his birth. He is surrounded, importuned, plied with eager questions. Everyone wants to know. The main part of the village has held out, but the fort? The assault must have been terrific. Who holds the fort? "It's all over," answers the officer laconically, snatching up a water bottle. "What do you mean it's all over? The fort has been captured?" "No, the Boche is beaten. and he finishes his drink in peace.
5. Round the washing place. March 18th.
In the inner courtyard of a Verdun barracks, around a vast washing place, there is a swarm of dark blue riflemen and light blue infantrymen who have just been fighting side by side, fraternally, and who seem ready to come to blows in order to gain a place and draw near to the delicious stream of running water. Will a regular system of shifts have to be established? The Line Regiment, 158th, and the Battalion of Light Infantry, 3rd, were relieved together last night. They went on firing up to the moment of going off, for they were defending the fort and village of Vaux, which the enemy is attacking so desperately. The battle is, for the time being, ancient history, since they have come back from it. After so many rough nights, they open their shirts and bare their arms to let their skins grow warm in the spring sun. No doubt the guns continue to rumble, and the columns of smoke rise from bombarded Jardin Fontaine. Aeroplanes flit about in the sky, encircled by the white wreaths of smoke which the shell bursts send up to them. But no one takes any notice. There is water to wash oneself with and to drink. Imagine what the sight of water and running water to boot must be for these lads who for 10 days have been unable to sluice themselves down or to refresh their parched lips properly. They enjoy in advance its cool, wholesome touch, and those who have plunged their dusty faces right into it, faces still worn with the noise and terror of battle, withdraw them all streaming, with a boisterous laugh of delight. It is their weariness that is falling away from them. The drawn, livid, mournful faces grow young again in a few moments. Each man would like to go on longer, but thinks of his neighbor who is waiting his turn and goes away to give up his place to the next man. Later on, he may be able to come back. Some, apart from the rest in the twinkling of an eye, set up a mirror on a windowsill or a tub, bring out a piece of soap, and begin to shave. The barber of one company is already working with the speed of a juggler, and his customers quietly wait in single file. Why on earth do civilians call them les poilus, the hairy ones? Here, no one likes the word. They are hairy when they cannot be anything else, on bad days, on the cruel and tragic days which afterwards become days of heroic grandeur. But as soon as they are off duty, they ask for nothing better than to resume their pleasant everyday faces, in no way terrifying or hirsute. It is a nation of worthy citizens who fight for their hearths, for their invaded territory, for their rights and their freedom, for all the past of which they are the heirs, for all the future of which they are the trustees, and not a horde of half-savage gypsies, ill-conditioned, without house or home. The youngest classes are nearly always beardless, and the oldest, in order to fix their gas masks better, have given up wearing beards. Almost the only exception I can see is the chaplain. He has a great black beard, here and there flecked with gray. He persists in driving a comb through it, for he is anxious not to appear less careful of his person than that group of trim young lieutenants who are already here, shaved, their hair brushed, in bright new uniforms, their mustaches turned up, their eyes sparkling, transformed by the stroke of a magic wand into garrison dandies. As well informed as a staff officer, Father C., whom I have already met at Fort Vaux, speaks with admiration, nay, with affection, of his dear light infantry battalion, his Blue Devils, with whom he has been from Artois and Notre-Dame de Lorette. He takes out of his pocket the precious notebook in which he records his impressions of army life. I should like to read one of the days in your diary. Just let me put down the last two, the 16th and 17th. The 3rd Battalion of Light Infantry will give its historian trouble. It has fought on every front. On August 10th, in Lorraine, it repulsed by itself at Provenchères 4 German attacks, 4 battalions strong. On the 14th, it is in the St. Blaise combat. On the 19th, it is in action at Valeristhal, where it is subjected to furious assaults. From August 29th to September 5th, it holds La Chipotte Wood. Then it is recalled to take part in the Battle of the Marne. At the beginning of October, it is sent to Artois. It is the first to enter the first house of a Blaine Saint-Nazaire. It is then sent farther north, to the long and stubborn Battle of Ypres. The men thought they would never go through anything worse, but Verdun is to come. In December, it returns to Artois, to the Lorette region. On May 8, 1915, it attacks the white earthworks with superb dash. In June, the square wood and the hollow way. In October, the wood of the axe. And Verdun comes to crown all these memories like a bunch of flowers decorating a housetop. It is a Homeric catalog. But how many of our regiments could tell a similar story? It has lost two of its commanding officers, Major Renaud at Bremenel on August 19, 1914, and in Artois on May 8, 1915, after the attack on the White Earthworks. That young Major Madeleine, who was the most finished type of an officer, cool-headed, yet always inspiring his men, well-groomed, genial, brilliant, and cultured. A brother of my dear comrade in letters and in arms, the historian, now Second Lieutenant Louis Madeleine, whom the fortune of war has suddenly thrown into my company, and who offers me a refuge in his plank-built hut. Major Madeleine was succeeded in Artois by my friend Major Pinault, whom I find again with the staff, then by Major Tournes, who has just come down from the Vaux sector, where I met him preparing an attack. Suddenly there is bustle in the courtyard. A company, whose losses I can guess, is gathering in a circle round the captain and the sergeant major. To judge by their craning necks and the gleam in their eyes, the report is of peculiar interest. Very likely it is a question of rest billets, or perhaps of furlough. Furlough, the mirage in which a man's house and loved ones appear before him. I draw near. The sergeant major is reading the order of the day addressed on March 10th by the commander-in-chief to the soldiers of Verdun. Quote, "Soldiers of the army of Verdun, for 3 weeks you have endured the most formidable assault that the enemy has yet attempted against us. Germany counted on the success of this offensive, which she thought irresistible, and to which she had devoted her best troops and her most powerful artillery. She hoped that the capture of Verdun would encourage her allies and convince neutral countries of German superiority. She had reckoned without you. Night and day, in spite of an unparalleled bombardment, you have withstood all attacks and held your positions. The struggle is not yet at an end, for the Germans need a victory. You will be able to rob them of that victory. We have munitions in plenty and numerous reserves. But above all, you have your indomitable courage and your faith in the destiny of the Republic. The eyes of the country are upon you. You will be among those of whom it will be said, they stopped the Germans from getting to Verdun." Unquote. The sergeant major himself, deeply moved by what he reads, leaves a pause between the last sentence and the official "dismiss," which sets his hearers free, and the company breaks up slowly, as if with regret. The men understand better what they have done, and the hardships they have undergone take on a new luster in their eyes. That sense of loneliness which in long conflicts leads each man, little by little, to complain of his individual trials, and to imagine that his leaders and the community as a whole are indifferent, suddenly vanishes. Down there, when they were in the jaws of hell, their commander and their countrymen saw everything. And in the silence which for a moment seals their lips, makes their features grave and motionless, and combines all those stray thoughts into one supreme idea, a historic thrill passes through them. Individual destinies grow wider. Nothing counts any longer but the collective task. Then they disperse into groups, and tongues are loosened. For the first time since the relief, they consent to speak of the 10 days spent in the Vaux sector. Their scattered impressions may be summed up in the proud boast. At any rate, they have decamped for tonight. The fierce, uninterrupted bombardment, so hard to endure for those who are out of action, gives rise to protests. The veterans of the Artois campaign compare notes and agree that they have never seen such an orgy of firing. "It ought not to be allowed," declares a new hand. Modestly, as if it were an everyday incident, a corporal of the 158th tells some light infantrymen of his share in the last engagement, that of the evening of March 16th in Vaux village, which is half French, half German, and is intersected by barricades and trenches. "I was in the village, near the barricade. After the Jack Johnsons, the lookout men told us that they were coming in masses. The parapets are manned. The lieutenant says, 'Don't hurry, my lads, let them come up.' When they are within easy range, our men open fire. The Boches were seen to fall like ninepins. Still they came on again and yet again. They have plenty of self-confidence." And now the talk flies to and fro like the crackling of musketry fire. The names of dead and wounded are mentioned, but there is no sadness, no lingering over them. It is a matter of fate, who chooses those whom it pleases her to strike. The praises of the stretcher-bearers are sung. Guided by cries or by instinct, they bring in the wounded, even that blind man who, erect between the lines, walked with his hands in front of him, without knowing where, haggard and howling. As for the dead, burying them was out of the question. Gratitude is expressed towards the cooks, who roll about their field kitchens under shell fire and carry rations to the troops. A burly Swiss who has enrolled himself for the duration of the war, without any idea that it would last so long, he adds, otherwise, receives these grateful words as a personal compliment. Well, you can't run with a great load on your back. The colonel whom I met at the Carrière headquarters, a thin face with clear-cut outlines, blue eyes, usually soft, but now and then showing a glint of steel, slight build, keen nerves, with an unswerving ascendancy over his men, whom he knows how to inspire with his hatred of the Boche. Hatred dies down so quickly in our race, can speak of nothing but his regiment. Hunger, thirst, lack of sleep, and all the time that din and that menace of big shells crashing, they bore it all without a murmur. You pass down the lines. Every man follows you with his eyes, centers his hopes in you, believes in you. You acquire such a feeling of confidence. You cannot help leading them well. Thus, from the close union of hearts, he makes leadership spring as the wheat springs from the fertilized soil. The chaplain has finished writing, and with the best grace in the world, he hands me the notes in which he has just been describing his stay in Fort Vaux and the immediate surroundings from March 6 to 17. They are moving pages, at once picturesque, sincere, and gently ironical. They take me once more over the road I have traveled, and recall the assault of March 10th on the slopes of the fort, as the actors in the drama had recounted it to me on the spot. On the following day, our command prepares in its turn a little expedition in order to gain possession of the foot of those hillsides where the Germans are invisible and our 75s cannot find their mark. Here is the account of this attack on the 16th and 17th. Extract from the diary of the Abbé C., chaplain to the 3rd Battalion of Light Infantry. Quote, Thursday the 16th, great activity during the night. The enemy shows obvious signs of anxiety and nervousness. Numerous rockets, constant work at their auxiliary defenses. All this delights our men. So they are afraid. So that irresistible dash which was to reach its climax at Verdun and to lead to a triumphal entry at the Champs-Élysées is being frittered away in dugouts. Feverishly, each man burrows himself in. The bayonet is abandoned for the pickaxe, and instead of those miraculous marches, there are only monotonous shifts. Yet the task is not yet ended. Verdun has 17 forts, I believe. You hold only one, my dear Brandenburgers. Hardly enough. 1:00 p.m. The bombardment increases in violence. The blows grow more and more resounding. It is clear that the earth of our roof has been carried away and that the concrete has been laid bare in several places. There is a talk of stopping up the gaps with sandbags. But when? A walk on our terrace is not to be recommended, even by moonlight. 2:00 p.m. The trench mortar which is to destroy the barbed wire and the auxiliary defenses cannot be fired from the fort. 3 artillerymen who were trying to set up the mortar have been wounded. An attempt is made elsewhere, but with still slighter success. Nor can our heavy artillery do anything. The attack, which was fixed for this evening, has been put off until 5:00 tomorrow. We are going to attempt a surprise stroke. 11:30 p.m., to arms. This cry, uttered by the lookout men, re-echoes from end to end of the dark corridors. At this hour, and during this crisis, when every moment is fraught with tragedy, it sounds peculiarly mournful. At once there is a stir among the poor numbed bodies, which were snatching an uneasy slumber on the floor. Each man fastens on his equipment and makes sure that his rifle is in its place. After the first few minutes of stupor, a discussion arises in low tones. What is going to happen? Some lookout men have seen, or think they have seen, say some, a working party digging trenches quite near the auxiliary defenses of the fort. Shadows, boats, stray patrols? When nerves are on edge, the pale moonlight, streaked with a few clouds, seems to make for hallucinations. The machine gun of the parapet sweeps the terrain. Nothing moves. Day will throw light upon the mystery. Obviously, the enemy is still more uneasy than on previous nights. His artillery thunders furiously all over the place, somewhat at random, particularly on the fort and its approaches. All the fatigues that arrive announce losses. The men are streaming with sweat after the desperate rush they have had to make for 400 yards across a bewildering mass of craters. Friday, March 17th, 2 a.m., our patrols are returning. They have searched the approaches thoroughly. No signs of the enemy, at any rate of live boats. In the morning, the sun brings us knowledge. There, a little in front of the barbed wire, we can see the earth recently turned up. At the side, some dozen diggers, their tools in their hands or at their feet, their bodies stiff and stark, still bent over their unfinished task. They are the Boches we saw yesterday evening, caught in the midst of their work by our machine gun. They had not even time to dig their ditch. But for the vigilance of our machine gun officer, we should have found there, at daybreak, a nest of Boches whom it would have been very difficult to get rid of in view of the lie of the land. A dangerous vigilance indeed. On the evening before, at the same place, not far from him, my left-hand neighbor was killed outright and my right-hand neighbor seriously wounded. At last we know what to do. A brief rest before the little performance. At 5 o'clock, the hour fixed, the commandant goes up to the observing station. I crouch down with my eye at the loophole. It is early dawn. The field of vision is very limited. We listen anxiously in the half-silence. It continues. So much the better. The plot is not discovered. After 10 minutes comes a violent interchange of hand grenades. We see the bluish smoke rise from the ground. The machine guns cough. Then nothing more. What agony! 20 minutes later, the captain who was directing the attack arrives. He is a brisk young officer of the Algerian cavalry who, at his own request, has doffed the scarlet jacket for the dark tunic of the light infantry. He has prepared his attack as a labor of love, working day and night. 2 days ago, it would have been an interesting coup de main, but after 3 days of countermanding orders, the conditions have entirely changed. He tells us what has happened. The 8 bomb throwers have cleverly crept up to the enemy's wire entanglements and discharged the contents of their haversacks, ready to hurl themselves into the barbed wire and jump further. But the Germans are numerous. Their slightly curved line begins to encircle our light infantry. They defend themselves. The interchange of hand grenades proceeds. Our bombs begin to tell. The Boches howl. Their bombs go much too far. They never dreamt that our blue devils were so near them. At the same time, their machine guns are brought into action, and with their infernal tempo, mow down all that is in their way. Under this shower of bombs and this sheet lightning of bullets, our men slip into the holes and a few minutes later come back unscathed, with smiles on their lips, delighted at their escapade. 2 scratches, that is all, in a run of more than 80 yards across the battlefield. Almost a miracle. The sortie, by the way, is far from useless. Thanks to this diversion, the neighboring detachment was able to gain a footing in a long line of enemy trenches, to see the occupants take to flight, and thus to make a still further improvement, to some extent, in our situation. And when night has stretched its protecting veil over us, we start off. Weakened, worn, feverish, dirty, physically at the end of our tether, but splendid so far as morale is concerned. One sees that by the sparkling eyes, the lively talk, the whole manner, which clearly shows the absolute control that these valiant souls maintain over their utterly exhausted bodies. More or less confusedly, but nonetheless genuinely for that, each man realizes that he has just lived through some glorious hours. Few in number, weary, isolated, they have held enormous masses in check. With their moral force, they have confronted a display of material power such as the world has never seen before. A few bodies have been broken. Victory has remained with the idea, with the human will, with cool, unyielding valor, with these children, the new knights-errant of a France whose existence no one suspected. They too are struggling under the eye of God, as their forebears have done so often, for right and justice, and for nearly 2 years have never ceased to offer an astonished world the wondrous spectacle of their self-denial and their heroism." Unquote. Yet no one sees anything but his own little corner of the war. And this applies even to the above eyewitness, who has a clear vision and a fluent pen. He limits the fighting of March 6 to 17 to our attack, a comparatively petty affair. But on March 16th, in the evening, there was an attempted German offensive which lasted throughout the night between the village and the fort. A battalion of the 7th German Regiment of Reserve, 121st Division, suffered cruel losses. A large number of prisoners captured to the southeast of the village admitted these losses and emphasized the seriousness of the setback. Beside us, the water of the washing place goes on streaming over the men's faces, necks, and hands. It wipes out the memory of their efforts and their hardships. These men, who when they came in thought that they were done up, feel a fresh strength, the strength that the future expects of them.
6. Reflections on death.
The same day. It is 5 o'clock in the evening. I go up to the top of a hill which overlooks Verdun. It is a glorious spring evening. The curves of the Meuse gleam in the setting sun and form a trail of fire on the dim plain, like a line of motor transports rushing through the night. The air is warm with caresses, and in this peaceful countryside nothing moves that is not for use in battle. Nothing exists save for war. Towards Froidterre and Souville, the shells, as they burst, raise dense pillars of black smoke. In the sky, a fleet of our aeroplanes is coming back to harbor. The captive balloons complete their observations while the light lasts. On the rising road, there is a never-ending procession of artillery wagons, traveling field kitchens, and troops. All this mass of men and war material is making for the lines in order to deliver stores or to take up positions in a few hours' time under cover of darkness. I stretch myself out on the grass in order to forget this contrast and merely enjoy the evening air. A little further on, there is someone who has had the same idea as I. He lies at full length and does not notice my presence. I should have preferred to be alone. I take another look at him. His face is one great wound. I go up to him. He is dead. One does not come here to cut oneself off from one's fellows and to dream. Nothing is done here save under the mantle of death. But with the war, death has lost much of its importance. We have grown familiar with it. Under the form in which it appears as a rule, not glorious, not choosing its victims in the full glow of their martial ardor, but crafty and terrible, in the shape of a mass of iron hurled from some miles off, it inspires a deep disgust, it is true, but we submit to it as we submit to an old servant who rules the household. If we do not rebel against it, if we even consent to accept it, then it transforms itself after the manner of sorcerers in the old-time fairy tales. The hideous skeleton is covered with young flesh that has a fragrance of flowers. The face that it shows is one of dazzling beauty. The kiss that it gives has something of the affection of France for her children. Yes, we have all become reconciled to the idea of death. What is there left for me if I outlive the war? From my remotest past to the present moment, all the years that I can take into account stay in my memory as a little water stays in the hollow of my hand. If I open my fingers, the water runs away. The past, which seems to me so short, far exceeds in length all the future that I can anticipate. How trifling a thing, then, is that future? Death does nothing more than open the fingers of time, who bears in his hand our days that are to come. And our days, as they fall, trickle noiselessly like drops of water. A dangerous detachment, this, a lethargic calm against which we must be on our guard. Death should merely annihilate our will to live, not weaken it beforehand. This lesson was unconsciously taught us by one of our comrades, Captain D., who was twice wounded and twice went back to the front, as he told us one evening at Verdun the story of his second wound. He was lying on the ground with his chest bared. His botman, who would not leave him, had also been wounded, but slightly, in the shoulder. Both were Bretons, both religious, and they had been to communion together in the morning before starting off for the battle. "We were there, side by side," he said, "and the rifle shots were growing more distant. I thought that I was going to die, and a great exultation came over me. My love for my wife and child, who I felt were soon to lose me, was in no way altered. I don't know how to explain it to you. Nothing weighed upon my mind any longer, and I seemed to be set free from my closest ties. How should I ever again meet with such an opportunity of dying? Everything within me and around me was light and easy as the flight of a bird. I was no longer in pain. Even the difficulty I felt in breathing gave me a sort of happiness. I seemed to be lifted up to God, as a leaf is lifted by the wind. Then I said to my botman, "You are going away. You are not seriously hurt. I will stay here. I am quite ready to die." He would not listen to me. He wanted to help me to rise, and being unable to do so, tried to carry me in spite of the pain in his shoulder. I would not allow him to lift me. "Leave me, I tell you, I want to die here." He stopped and looked at me as if he did not quite understand, and then a little timidly at first, but soon growing bolder, he rebuked me. "I beg pardon, sir, but what you are doing is not a Christian thing to do." I was shocked, I admit, I who thought myself so near to God. He went on, "Not Christian at all. God has nothing to give you but life. You are not going to offend him. But when it is he that is calling me, if he calls you, you will hear him plainly. Meanwhile, you are still alive, and the life that he gives us is for us to enjoy as long as we can, for his sake, of course. You are not going to affront him." And I let myself be carried away in order not to affront God. Night has now fallen over Verdun. Here are the stretcher-bearers come to look for my neighbor. The town is already shrouded in darkness, while its girdle of hills seems still to float like a streamer in the light. It is time to go down again. The realization of death at this moment demands action of us, not reflection.
7. The enemy's evidence.
I have spoken, without hiding anything, of the hard life led by our soldiers in the region of Vaux, the terrific assaults and the appalling bombardment that they had to endure, the difficulty of obtaining rations and reliefs, the lack of shelter, the lack of water, the lack of sleep. But in war, it is not enough to suffer, to resist, to hold out. One must strike the enemy and drive him back. The task of the army of Verdun is to wear out the German army before Verdun. Does our artillery fire work serious havoc in his ranks? Does it interfere with his replenishing and reliefs even more than ours are hampered? Does our infantry lay his foot soldiers low when it marches to the assault? Do our counterattacks throw them back with losses? What sort of existence do we compel the Boche to lead opposite our lines? We want to know, we must know. Our efforts must not be in vain. Our sacrifices must not be fruitless. The enemy is going to give us his evidence. He will tell us whether we are able to defend ourselves and to attack, and whether we allow him any respite. A few examinations of prisoners and some extracts from letters found on prisoners and dead, solely in the region of Vaux, during the months of March and April, will furnish us with all the information that we need. It is the most trustworthy source. I have collected the most significant records, but all tell a similar story. It is not to detract from an adversary that we make him confess what he has undergone and what losses he has suffered, but it is to show up more vividly the strength of our fighting forces and the successes gained by the soldiers of Verdun. The prisoners of the 9th and 13th Companies of the 19th Regiment, 9th Reserve Division, 5th Corps of Reserves, taken at Vaux on March 9th, give the following account of the engagement of March 9th. Quote, "On the morning of March 9th, the 1st Battalion received orders to occupy Vaux village, whose capture had already been announced. The 13th Company was the first to enter the village, in column of fours, without any scouts or advanced guard to screen it. Suddenly, it was assailed by a violent machine gun fire, followed up by a bayonet charge. Our men made off and defended themselves in the houses, where the French slaughtered them with bombs. The prisoners are under the impression that the whole of the 13th Company was wiped out. The 3rd Battalion attacked on the northern slope of the fort. The 9th Company led the way and joined battle in succession of platoons. The platoon to which the prisoners belong hurled itself at an enemy trench and was mown down by our machine guns. 25 men were killed, 3 were taken prisoner, the rest took to flight." Unquote. The prisoners of the 9th Company of the 7th Regiment of Reserves, 121st Division, taken on March 17th to the southeast of Vaux village, give the following details of the combat of March 16th to 17th. Quote, "The 3rd Battalion of the 7th Regiment of Reserves, was to attack towards the northern slopes of Fort Vaux. More than half the battalion was cut down by the French machine guns. Some 20 men, at most, of the 9th Company reached the enemy trenches, where they were captured. The rest must have been annihilated, for the curtain fire prevented them from escaping and getting back to the trenches from which they started. The revictualling of the first-line troops is almost impossible. The troops are reduced to consuming their emergency rations." Unquote. A soldier of the same regiment records a scene described to him by a comrade who has just come back from special leave. The latter saw a convoy of prisoners pass at a station in Germany. Women were jeering at them and insulting them. One of the Frenchmen called out in German, "Women of Germany, don't jeer at us. We are prisoners, that's true, but in front of Verdun, the Germans are lying in heaps as high as this." After that, the German women said no more. Here are some extracts from letters found on prisoners or dead in the Vaux sector. Private E of the 6th Liebe Grenadier Regiment writes, quote, "Before Verdun, March 10th. Since yesterday morning there has been a heavy snowfall. It stops everything and interferes with the operations before Verdun. We can't get away from the cold, the rain, the snow, and the mud, and we camp out in the open. Each man digs himself in as best he can, wraps himself up in his coat and his canvas bag, and freezes all night. To make matters worse, we are constantly under an artillery fire which claims a large number of victims every evening, for we have no trenches or shelter. Up to the present, we have been in the second line. Tonight, we pass into the first line. We no longer have any confidence in our heavy artillery. Yesterday morning, our division captured Vaux fort and village, but had to evacuate them because our artillery fired into the place without a break." Unquote. Private E believed what he had been told of the capture of the fort. The lieutenant of the 7th Regiment of Reserves, which is on the slopes of Vaux, knows the real truth. Quote, "March 11th. At 3 o'clock, we start off for the position in front of Fort Vaux. At sunrise, we occupy the position which was held by the 6th Regiment. The fort is 200 yards in front of this line. The position consists of shell holes which have no longer any spaces left between them." Unquote. 200 yards. He seems to be a little short-sighted. At 300 yards from the fort, on March 11th, one saw nothing but corpses. Some days later, a soldier whose name is illegible scribbled this note on the hillsides of Vaux. Quote, "March 24th, 1916, before Fort Vaux. There is no need for me to write any more. All the rest may be left to the imagination. Still, I want to be hopeful. It's hard, very hard. I am still so young. What's the use? What's the good of prayer and entreaty? The shells, the shells." Unquote. The next letter was found on a wounded German of the 56th Regiment of Reserves, 121st Division, captured on April 2nd. It bears no date. It mingles religion with the food question. The writer had no doubt just finished it and had had no time to send it off. Quote, "My dear sister and brother-in-law, this is to let you know I am in good health, although half dead from fatigue and fright. I cannot describe to you all I have lived through here. It goes far beyond anything we had had to put up with before. In about 3 days, the company has lost more than 100 men. Several times I didn't know whether I was alive or already dead. We have not yet had to face the enemy. We shall do so tomorrow, and the affair will be on a pretty big scale. I have already given up all hope of ever seeing you again. Whoever comes out of this without a scratch may well thank the Lord. I received your parcel, as I have already told you in my postcard, and I ate the food at once, for I didn't know whether I should have a chance of eating it later. I have sent my pay home because we cannot find anything to buy here." Unquote. On April 3rd, Lieutenant E of the 6th Regiment of Reserves, 9th Division, writes to 2nd Lieutenant L of the 202nd Regiment of Reserves, quote, "April 3rd. You can get some idea of how things are with us from the fact that the Corps of Officers has been entirely renewed. The losses of the regiment are rather heavy, for its position, Vaux tableland, is a rather unpleasant one. Our battalions relieve each other, but the rest stations are shelled quite as much as the first line, apart from a very few exceptions." Unquote. The following letter from Private S of the 20th Regiment of Reserves is undated. Quote, You cannot realize how utterly sick of life I feel at times. Yesterday the weather was still abominable, and we were once more drenched to the skin. Then someone said, "Why don't they sing today?" And in the midst of all our misery, we had to sing. Unquote. Private S. of the 80th Regiment writes on April 11th, 1916, quote, "We are here in a pit of hell, with artillery fire day and night. I never thought that it would be like this. Yesterday a shell fell quite near the church. 3 men were killed on the spot and 9 wounded. You should have seen us bolt. If only this wretched war would end. No one who has any sense can justify such a butchery of men. At present we are to the northeast of Verdun, certainly in a very ticklish situation. Although we have not been stationed here long, we have all had enough of it and are simply longing for peace. We should like to send to the front all those gentry who are responsible for the war and still take an interest in it. If only that could have been managed, we should have had peace long ago." Unquote. Finally, here's a letter that gives fuller details as to the effect of our artillery and machine guns. It is written by Lieutenant H. of the 81st Regiment and was found upon him at the time of his capture before Verdun. Quote, "At the front, April 15th, 1916. My dear parents, no doubt you are waiting impatiently for some sign of life from me. I hope this letter will reach you, but it is not easy to get one's correspondence sent through the post. The good time I had as liaison officer between our regiment and the 56th has been a thing of the past for several days. Our officer losses are rather serious, so that I have had to take over the 8th Company as company commander in the first line. I am with my company at present. I am huddled up in a little hole in the mud, which has to protect me against the enemy shell bursts, and they never leave off for a moment. I have already seen a good many things in this war, but I had not yet been in such a situation as this. Its horror simply beggars description. I don't want to give you a detailed account, for I should only cause you needless anxiety. We are under a terrific artillery fire day and night. The French resistance is amazingly obstinate. On April 11th, we made an attack in order to take their trenches. We opened with an artillery preparation on a tremendous scale, lasting 12 hours, and then the infantry assault was launched. The French machine guns were entirely undamaged, the result being that the first wave of our onset was broken by machine gun fire as soon as it left the trench. What is more, the French in their turn started such an artillery barrage that another attack was not to be thought of. We are in the first-line trench, about 120 yards from the enemy. The weather is miserable, always cold and rainy. I wish you could see the state I am in. Boots, trousers, and cape soaking wet and covered with a layer of mud quite an inch thick. All the roads are commanded by the French guns, and their fire is so incessant that we cannot even bury our dead. It is pitiful to see the poor devils lying dead in their mud holes. Every day, some of our men are killed and wounded. It is only by risking our lives that we can put the wounded in a place of safety. To get our meals, we have to go over 2 miles to the rear, to the traveling field kitchens, and even there, one is in danger of being killed. Every day, there are casualties among those who go for their rations. So much so that many would rather endure hunger than make these dangerous expeditions for food. Nearly the whole company is sick. When you are out in the rain all day and get wet through, sleep in the mud, and are under a frightful bombardment night and day, and all this for a week at a time, your nerves become completely shattered. So far as health is concerned, I am still in fairly good trim. My feet are very wet and cold, and I am fearfully chilly about the knees. I hope I shall have the luck to get out of this alive. One cannot even be buried properly here." Unquote. Some answers received from Germany add a few touches to this picture of the German army in the Vaux sector. The following letter, covered with stains, was found on a dead man. It had been kept in spite of its having been written so long ago. Quote, "Cologne, December 29th, 1915. There is no doubt, my dear Willie, that we are living through very hard times, and one cannot yet see where it will all end. You tell me not to believe all that the newspapers say. But do you really think we believe, as we did at first, in that rollicking mood, Hurra-Stimmung, among the men at the front? A year ago, we fancied that we heard the note of warlike enthusiasm in every song that the soldiers sang. But yesterday, I happened to be present when 30 to 35 men of the Landsturm were starting off. 5 of them were singing at the top of their voices, "Dear Fatherland, goodbye." But these 5 were so drunk that they had to lean against each other for support. Some 100 yards behind the group, 3 policemen were marching and watching them to see that this enthusiasm was not overdone at the station. When we look at such scenes and then read the newspaper reports of deeds of valor, do you imagine that we think only of the latter? Yes, Willie, that's what war is like. The beneficent war that had to come. The war that was needed in order that the world should become a better place to live in. It is strange that after 17 months of war, I have not yet been able to discover any sign of improvement among my immediate neighbors. Unquote. On the prisoners, these letters were found, quote, Heisen, March 24, 1916. It is still better to be at the front than here. We are suffering terribly from the cold and have to wait in a queue from morning till evening, and even then we sometimes come home empty-handed at the end of the day and having nothing to eat. It is very sad, but you, my dear Fritz, are holding out in the enemy's country. We shall hold out here as well. Unquote. Quote, Strasbourg, Prussia, March 20th, 1916. You write to us that you have had to suck snow, so great was your hunger, yet that was hardly likely to cure your pangs. Yes, my dear, you have to starve, but do you think things are any better here? Unquote. These extracts will suffice. What is the use of publishing any more? Further letters would give us no more information as to the state of the German soldier before Fort Vaux. We could find enough and to spare of complaints about economic difficulties. That the German soldier who is fighting at Verdun should know so much of the material insecurity of those whom he has left behind him is a righteous punishment for the terrible scourge let loose by a whole nation drunk with the sense of power, the nation which sneered when Paris starved in 1870 and which has set out to organize a war of frightfulness. The fires of its hell burn hotter and hotter. To Montmar Wood and Le Pretre Wood, which lie west of Pont-à-Mousson, where the plains of the Woevre meet the undulating country of La Haye, the German soldiers gave the names of Widow's Wood and Wood of Death, respectively. What will they call the region of Vaux? It was the 6th Division of the 3rd Corps that attacked the earthwork of Hardalmont at the beginning of March. The assaults on Vaux village and fort on March 8th, 9th, and 10th were delivered by the 9th Reserve Division of the 5th Corps. I have quoted, without comment, examinations of prisoners and extracts from letters. The proof is given by the enemy in person, over the soil of France which he came to trample upon. Our artillery and our infantry deal him out death in ample measure, or when he escapes death, force him to lead a somewhat harassed existence. That, no doubt, is what he calls an amazingly obstinate resistance. How curious is this phrase, as if the Germans were surprised and shocked at our resisting at all. How striking was the attitude of prisoners whom I have seen examined, and of whom not one, though he might be wounded, puny, hideous, or brutish, forbore to flaunt his pride in being a German. These experiences led me to dip into a notebook, in which I have copied out various passages from distinguished authors peculiarly fitted to give us food for our war reflections, and look up an extract from Fustel de Coulanges on the German method of writing history. The German historians, he says, can find nothing nobler in history than that German emperor who pitches his camp on the heights of Montmartre, or that other emperor who goes to carry off the imperial crown in Rome after wading through the blood of 4,000 Romans slaughtered on the bridge of St. Angelo. But when the French at last put an end to these repeated invasions, when Henry II, Richelieu, Louis XIV, by fortifying Metz and Strasbourg, saved France and Italy from these Teutonic inundations, then the German historians are up in arms and make virtuous protests against the Gallic lust for aggrandizement. They cannot forgive those who try to prevent them from imposing their sway on other nations. To defend oneself against them is a sign of war mania. To prevent them from robbing is to be oneself a robber. The German historians of a later day will find matter for indignation in the breakwater at Verdun, against which so many waves of their soldiery have dashed themselves in vain. Let us hope at least that our own historians, in recounting the superhuman efforts put forth in a carefully planned resistance destined, by the way, to be changed into an offensive in the course of the Verdun battle, will enhance among future generations their pride in being sons of France.
8. From March 30th to May 31st.
Who shall sing the epic of Fort Vaux in its daily phases? Relieved at due intervals, the troops succeed each other with the same staying power in the same inferno. Shall we ever know all the feats worthy of record in this war of countless episodes? How many dead would have to be awakened from their sleep and asked for their testimony? The living walls of Verdun, like the medieval cathedrals, have been built by a multitude of nameless toilers. To single out any regiment or individual is to do an injustice to those who are not singled out. Yet instances must be mentioned here in order to give flesh and bones to the framework of my story. Before I begin, I will apologize for so many unintentional omissions, since I could not know everything or collect every detail. In order to gain possession of the town, the enemy, after taking Duomo, the resounding syllables of whose name boom like a great bell through his communiques, tries to approach the main line of defense. Foix de Terre, Fleury, Souville. Vaux fort and village is one of the mainstays of that line. From March 9th, he pounds the slopes of the fort and the approaches to the village. He continues to make frontal attacks on them, and at the same time attempts his usual maneuver of envelopment, on the one side debouching in La Cayette Wood, and on the other side outflanking us in the village of Damloup. Damloup, to the southeast of the fort, runs out like a pierhead between two ravines, the gap of La Horne, which separates it from the fort, and the gap of La Gayette, which sweeps down from La Lofe Wood. To the northeast, Vaux village, the eastern portion of which has been lost, lies at the side of the Dieppe road, in the ravine of Le Bazil, the entrance to which it commands. As you go up the ravine, you find, after traversing 150 or 200 yards, a dike, then a little lake, the Pool of Vaux. At this point is the end of the ravine of Fontaine, called by our men the Ravine of Death, which cuts across Vaux-Chapitre Wood. The enemy lays siege to the village, but at the same time he also tries to get down into the ravine of Le Bazil by advancing through La Cayette Wood. In this wild country, broken up by clumps of trees, brushwood, narrow glens, and gorges, a dim, dogged struggle will be waged, dragging on for weeks and even months. The enemy, at the end of March, has brought back the 121st Division from the Wavre front. On March 21st, after having made an important reconnaissance on the previous evening, he overwhelms the fort, the village, and the ravine of Le Bazil with shells. These are the harbingers of an assault. The telephone communications are cut, and the connection service is kept up by means of scouts, since the broken ground makes signaling impossible, except on the plateau of the fort. A liquid fire attack precedes the three waves of the onset, each a battalion strong, which dash in succession against the village. The first is battered down. The two others, at a terrible cost in lives, manage to encircle the three companies which still occupy the western section. On April 2nd, the 1st Battalion of the 149th Regiment, under Major Maganiosk, which occupies the shelters of the Les Fontaines ravine, is ordered to reoccupy the village. At daybreak, it makes for the dike, where it breaks up into three detachments, each consisting of a company, with the fourth as a support. One company has the main road for its objective. Another will operate farther north, between the railway and the brook, in conjunction with the 31st Battalion of Light Infantry, the third farther south through the gardens. In a few strides, our men have reached the village and advanced as far as the church. An artillery barrage, however, cuts them off and prevents reinforcements from coming up to them. The liaison officers who succeed in crossing this incessant curtain fire bring news that at first cheers us, but then becomes more and more alarming. The assailants have had to face a counterattack and have been swept away by the storming party. On the right bank, in the gardens, the company commander, Lieutenant Vassière, has been killed, and his men have been thrown back. In the village, there is hand-to-hand fighting. All the officers of the 3rd Detachment have been killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, among them Captain Toussaint, commanding the 2nd Company, who, though seriously wounded, was still exhorting his men not to surrender. Non-commissioned officers take their places. The enemy sets fire to the houses by means of petrol. Sergeant Chef has rallied the survivors, and stationing them with a machine gun section at the exit by the side of the pool, has barricaded himself in the last house, dug a trench, and brought the enemy to a halt. To the north, Sergeant Chappelle holds out in the same way, with some details until nightfall. The men work in pairs. One makes a dugout while his comrade fires. The German losses are heavy. A private who saw them said, "Yes, there were a good many of them laid out. Although the village is lost, but for the last house, the dike road is blocked up." On the northern side of the ravine, however, the Germans have managed to get near the railway. Early next day, the 74th Regiment retakes the lost trenches of La Cayette and, continuing his advance, pushes his listening posts up to the ridge of far-famed Douaumont. How can we tell the full story of all these fights, scarcely interrupted for a moment, and all these feats of valor? On April 11th, the enemy attacks with 2 divisions placed side by side on a front of 1¾ miles from Fort Douaumont to Fort Vaux. He is driven back. On the 15th, we attack him with 3 battalions of the 36th Regiment and details of the 120th between the ravine of La Cayette and that of La Fausse-Côte, and take nearly 200 prisoners. On the 19th, the attack is resumed. The 81st Brigade carries a small fort crammed with dead and wounded, captures 260 prisoners, among them 9 officers, 4 cadets, and 16 non-commissioned officers, and seizes machine guns and a large quantity of flamethrowers. In vain, the enemy tries to renew the offensive 3 days running. He is unable to rob us of the trenches we have captured after so severe a struggle. All this month of April is favorable to us in the Vaux region. General Nivelle, who is in command of the sector, in accordance with instructions received from the Commander-in-Chief and from General Pétain, the leader of the Army of Verdun, has given orders for an active defense, which raises the morale of the troops and baffles the purpose of the foe. Satisfied with the results obtained on both banks of the Meuse during the recent operations, General Pétain, summoned by the Commander-in-Chief on April 30th to take command of the central group of armies, before handing over to General Nivelle the command of the Second Army, addresses the troops in an army order in which he says, quote, "One of the greatest battles recorded in history has been raging for more than 2 months round Verdun. Thanks to all, officers and men, thanks to the devotion and self-denial shown by the various branches of the service, a notable blow has been struck at the military power of Germany." Unquote. During the month of May, a definite goal is aimed at, a task likely to provide us with many thrills, the recapture of Fort Douaumont. What a slap in the face this would be for German pride. Douaumont, which has made the Teuton blow a loud trumpet blast of victory. Douaumont, a conquest won by surreptitious means and emblazoned with the glory of a fictitious assault. Douaumont lost again would mean an outcry of astonishment and wrath over the whole empire. And on May 22nd, our gallant lads re-enter Fort Douaumont. Soldiers of Mangin's division, battalions of the 36th, 129th, 74th, and 54th Regiments, you will remember that hour and that date when you matched the most daring conquerors. Fort Vaux followed them from its observing stations and saw them break through by the southern breach. It aided them with its guns in the direction of Hardemont and La Cayette, and its walls, which resounded under the enemy's bombardment, seemed to tremble with joy, even as the hills of Israel leapt at the deliverance of its old comrade. From the fort of Vaux to the pool, the defenses staked out on the slopes of the hill are connected by 3 redoubts or entrenchments more or less knocked to pieces. R to the power of 1, 2, and 3 in the abbreviated style of the reports. Captain Delvert, who from May 17th to 24th has occupied R to the power of 1 with the 8th Company of the 101st Regiment, and who will occupy it again from May 31st to June 5th during the critical period, is one of those officers whom the war has revealed to themselves by abruptly withdrawing them from the civilian careers in which they had earned distinction. A student and a thinker with a fellowship in history, he is the contemporary and was the close friend of Émile Clermont, the tender, subtle, and pathetic novelist of Lore and Amour Promise, who before he was killed in a trench was able to draw lessons favorable to his inner development from the scenes of bloodshed which he held in instinctive horror. His generation was at that meeting place of all the roads of the new age which has been marked by a certain indecision in all, or nearly all of us in our turn. The war, making him a leader of men, will have prepared him for leadership in the intellectual world. He wears the Legion of Honor and the War Cross. Of middle height, with a sunburnt complexion, his eyes full of glittering fire behind his pince-nez, his voice low, and his gestures eloquent, he has acquired the habit of looking at himself from outside, recommended by Stendhal and his followers. He analyzes himself while he acts. He sees himself in action without being inconvenienced by the presence of this clear-sighted eyewitness. Accordingly, he has a precise notion of all that is happening and realizes the full significance of each event. The background of the canvas does not escape him. He can easily reproduce the stage setting of the episodes, which he paints like an artist, with rapid, sweeping strokes and warm colors. Men of this type will later on make admirable chroniclers. At the most tragic moments, he notices the statuesque pose of a bomb thrower, or is capable of feeling the warm caress of a sunbeam. More than once I shall have recourse to the notes which he has allowed me to consult. The concise yet passionate style of his personal comments must be left to the imagination. During the night of May 17th to 18th, Captain Delvert, with his company, reaches the entrenchment R to the power of one by way of the ravine of Les Fontaines. On the way, the commander of the battalion which he is relieving receives him in his quarters and conveys his instructions to him. He is a tall man, writes Captain Delvert, slim, about 50 years of age, his face clean-shaven. This face is lighted up by a pair of fine, intelligent eyes, and his lips pucker up into an ironical smile. There is a portrait in a few lines. He receives us, continues the captain, in a charming manner. A conversation is struck up with our battalion commander. We are going to the dike. Has it been much shelled with heavies? Well, well, answers the major very coolly. One of my officers counted in his sector an average of 4 shells a minute in a whole day. And the major? What about his headquarters? Still in pretty good condition, but you can't get out of the place. It opens out onto a ravine which is constantly being shelled. And where do these shells fall? On the north, west, and east. It is only on the southern side that we don't get any, except when our 155s fire short. And then you will have totos. Totos? Yes, well, fleas if you like. Everybody has them. We emerge from the major's quarters and pass into the gallery which leads to the ravine of Les Fontaines. The country becomes more and more dismal and desolate. The trees are already nothing more than stumps. To make matters worse, since we have had a lot of rain, the gallery changes into a canal with water a foot or more deep. And now the rain of shells begins. What the captain said is right. It comes from every direction except the south. At last, Captain Delvert reaches his post. Every day he draws up his balance sheet, just as the officer of the watch on a cruiser writes out his log. Here is the record of his days from May 18th to 24. It is a picture of the life our men lead in the Vaux region. Diary of Captain Delvert, May 18th to 24. Quote, Thursday, May 18th. My trench by the side of the railway commands the ravine of Vaux, which is riddled like a sieve with shell craters full of water. That ruin in front, some 60 or 80 yards from the village, is the western house of Vaux, mentioned in the communiques. The village is now nothing more than a mass of crumbling walls, which our 155mm guns are constantly battering. In front of headquarters is Fort Vaux. To the north and east, it is surrounded by the Boche trenches. The dreariness of the landscape is beyond description. At this moment, 7 p.m., it is bathed in the soft, warm, purple light of the setting sun. The ridges of the hill are bare, without a blade of grass. The Fumin wood is reduced to a few tree stumps, ranged like the teeth of a comb along its summit, like that wood of the hand of Massacres, which our troopers have nicknamed the coxcomb. The soil has been so much churned up by the shells that the earth has become as shifting as sand, and the shell holes make the place look like a range of dunes. All of a sudden, the cannonade, which had slackened off a little, breaks out in all its fury. In 1 minute, we count 8 Boke shells whistling over our heads. On the ridge of Vaux, which shows up purple against the setting sun, the black clouds of our 155s rise in every direction. It is an orchestra of hell. The commandant's office is a shell hole covered with a few beams and a little earth. Under the floor are corpses, perhaps those whom the shell has buried. The occupants go to sleep on the floor, their heads resting on their knapsacks. The men are crowded together in recesses that certainly would not shelter them from the rain. Let us wait, Friday the 19th. The cannonade never stops day or night. It deafens our ears and clouds our brains. Today, since 6 p.m., the hillsides of Vaux have been disappearing under our shell fire. From here, one can see them falling right onto the white lines formed in the ground by the Boche trenches and communication passages. At night, in the starlight, green rockets shoot up from our front lines at the bottom of the ravines. Lengthen the range, cry our poor comrades. Other shouts are then heard from all sides. Red rockets on the Hardamont plateau. We are attacked. Fire, lads, fire. Bar the way in front of our trenches. Red rockets from Fort Vaux. Red rockets down there, far off behind Fumin. How many desperate appeals all over this gloomy countryside. Meanwhile, the Boche from their lines send up other kinds of rockets, trench flares, or star shells. These flash forth from the darkness every moment in order to ensure that no shovelful of earth shall be removed by the victims marked out for annihilation by the shells. The whistling of the projectiles which cross each other above our heads is so loud that you might imagine yourself to be by the sea, with the swell of the waves as they rise and fall, crashing in your ears. The explosions, with their tremendous uproar, produce the effect of a continual thunderstorm, accompanied by periodic flashes of lightning. Saturday the 20th, 11 p.m. The lake, with its dreary waters and its somber setting, runs right up to the 3 ridges that shut in the horizon. The moon hangs over this distant quarter like a silver veil, dotted with darker specks along the summit of the hills. At the foot of our trenches, she sheds her shimmering light over the marsh of the ravine, so that it forms a burnished island amid the ripple of the waters. To the right on the dike, a procession of funereal shadows glides past in silence. It is the relief that is going by. At a steady pace, never stumbling, it climbs up towards the Hardamont plateau, where our shells are crashing and the white, red, or green cones rise unceasingly into the sky, a firework display given by men marked out for death. Sunday, May 21st, the fine weather continues. So does the cannonade. Midnight. This evening at nightfall, the Boche sent us tear shells. These gases are extremely unpleasant. Your eyes smart, you weep, you choke, you get a splitting headache. What a torment. The cannonade becomes fast and furious. The 24th will soon have to attack on the hillsides of Vaux in front of R to the power of 1. All my men are at their posts. The hill that commands Fort Vaux stretches out its dark line beneath the half-red disk of the moon. It is reflected down below, a motionless shadow in the marsh at the foot of our trenches. The horizon, the fort, the ravine, and the distant dip of the Woevre are wrapped in a silvery mist. Near me, right and left, I see in the darkness, above the trench, the dim glint of the men's helmets. I think of the terrace of Elsinore and of the sentries relieving each other there during the night. Here the sentries get no relief. Under those helmets, their eyes are watchfully sweeping the ravine, the embankment slope, and the ballast of the railway. On all sides there spurts up the lurid flame of the crashing shells. The splinters fall like a heavy shower of rain into the marshes. Others come humming like a top and land in the trenches. The half-hidden, sinister struggle goes on. At 10 minutes to 2, the cannonade grows more intense. Rifles and machine guns spit and crackle. The night is made hideous with a confused uproar that re-echoes in the valley. Red rockets dart up incessantly from the German lines. On the parapet, with straining eyes, our rifles in our hands, dumb with horror, we witness a mysterious duel in which we hear the din without seeing the actors. Green rockets flare up from our trenches. "Lengthen the range," is the cry, while a Boche machine gun emits its crisp, abrupt note. Another machine gun that the artillery preparation has forgotten. The valley is filled with a dense vapor, a blend of dust and smoke, which hides everything from view. On the Hardemont Plateau, dawn begins to appear, but the struggle goes on without respite. It rages more and more furiously in the fog, a fog through which the rockets cleave a fiery trail and the red flames of the shell bursts are constantly darting up. From all sides, the bullets whistle around us. The youngsters of the 1916 class, now receiving their baptism of fire, cluster round the sides of the parapet. We officers and NCOs, our rifles in our hands, spur them on to fight. Very soon each finds his mark among the Boches, who can be seen, now that day has risen, gradually receding all along the hillsides of Vaux. Monday, May 22nd, a cartridge base of 130 millimeters has entered my dugout, broken my botman's leg, and flattened itself out on the wall near my head. 11 o'clock. German counterattack on the trench taken this morning by the 129th. Boche detachments are crossing the slopes. We fire at them. They can be seen lying down flat on the ground, then proceeding again at the double. There is one who still lies prone. He must have been hit. One must admit that they are brave soldiers, these fellows. They have reached the trench. A hand grenade duel begins. An appalling fire is directed at Fumin, through which other units of the 124th are to come as reinforcements. To our left, Douaumont has been recaptured since this morning. Wednesday, May 24th, 1 o'clock in the morning. This time it is hell indeed. The night is as black as ink. The little valley now seems a gigantic chasm girdled by fantastic hills, great somber masses with vague outlines. At the bottom of the chasm, the pools of the marsh glitter mysteriously in the dark. Dim vapors rise incessantly, accompanied by a terrific noise. Red and white gleams cut athwart each other, so that out of the shadows there suddenly leap up mountains of darkness which appear for a moment to be encircled with light, then vanish at once into the night. Through the heavy air, in which one can scarcely breathe for dust and smoke, there is all the time an invisible gliding to and fro, a frightful whistling, roaring, and crackling, and a spurting of flames that seems endless. Is it the twilight of the gods, the Götterdämmerung, which haunted the sublime imagination of their barbarian giant? Is the earth yawning, and is that savage world whose monstrous maw well-nigh devoured humanity sinking into a fiery pit? No. It is merely an episode of the war, the German counterattack on R to the power of 1. Perhaps it will get a line in the communiques, 8 o'clock. The hillsides of Vaux seem more sinister than ever. All along the German trench that is being fought over, rigid bodies stiff and stark in blue greatcoats, black trails. The soil, in places, looks as if it were burnt. One corpse has been stripped of its greatcoat. We can see that naked back in the sunlight. Unquote. Each episode of the combat is linked up with the operation as a whole. The attack on Douaumont will have an immediate effect on the rest of the fighting. The battle on the Verdun front is a part of the single battle that is being waged on all the fronts. Accordingly, the beleaguered islet of Vaux is about to rivet the attention of the entire globe. Our troops have been unable to hold their ground in Fort Douaumont, of which they only occupied the superstructure and a part of the casemates. On May 24th, a German counteroffensive has succeeded in enveloping and retaking the earthwork. It seems as if the daring enterprise of May 22nd had aroused their anger as a strip of red cloth excites a bull. They nearly lost Douaumont, so outrageous an insult decides them to rush on Verdun with redoubled fury. They devote to the onslaught a new force, the 1st Bavarian Corps. On May 25th, 26th, and 27, they pounce upon Thiaumont Farm in the direction of Freude-Terre. From May 31st onwards, they move slantwise on their left, and flinging themselves at Fort Vaux, will not resign themselves to abandoning the prey which they covet and which they thought was in their grip 8 months ago. Their plan will be to outflank the fort to the west by way of the ravines of Le Basile and Les Fontaines, and to the east by way of Damloup. On May 31st, our line is carried up again beyond the Le Basile ravine, so as to wind round the Hardemont salient, which belongs to us, through La Cayette Wood. Then it runs back, crossing the ravine by the dike, passes in front of the entrenchments R to the power of 3, 2, and 1, envelops the fort at a distance of barely 200 yards from the counterscarp, sweeps down into Lahorn Bottom, is thrust out into a point at Damloup Village, and bends back into La Gayette Bottom in front of La Lofay. The Hardemont salient and Damloup Village run out from the line like spires, and their defense is a hazardous business. The entrenchments have been broken up. What sort of a barrier can the fort still provide?
This concludes today's reading of The Last Days of Fort Vaux by Henry Bordeaux. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.